All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming to our last breakout sessions for the Information Literacy Summit this year. Remember, we do have our keynote address, our final keynote or closing keynote address right after the breakout session here. But today, here in breakout session B, we have Molly Mansfield from Dominican University here in the sunny Chicago region. And her presentation is Rethinking and Reimagining Information Literacy, Structured with an Inclusive Teaching and Learning Lens. Thank you, Molly, for coming. And I'm Jason Ertz. I'll be your moderator. If you have any questions or concerns or problems, go ahead and let me know in the chat box. Take it away, Molly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Can I get somebody a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? You can see my slide that says rethinking. I don't know, Jason, if you think like Jason, okay. So I'm so excited because I just got a message from a colleague that I haven't seen in over 5 years in the chat. So nice to see you, Nancy. I can see that. And I see some other colleagues that I know from other work that I've done. And so I just want to say thank you for taking the time at this, last session of the conference. I know that can be hard to muster. And I just want to say that, feel free to join in this conversation by raising your hand, putting questions in the chat. I'm going to be totally transparent with you that I have done presentations on inclusive teaching for teaching faculty, either at my institution or at other conferences that are geared towards higher ed educators. I've never done this for a set of librarians. So believe it or not, I'm a little bit extra nervous for some reason. So I just want to say a warm thank you to all of you for attending today. So we will go ahead and get started. So kind of a long introduction, stay with me if you can. I am the online learning and instructional services librarian at Dominican. I'm going to talk to you guys today about some work that I've done and learned about for inclusive teaching and how I understand it in the relationship to information literacy instruction. And again, for transparency, I'm not a master in this information. I'm still learning and growing on my journey to understand and embrace inclusivity in education. And I also put this proposal together last year. So before we had gone through a global pandemic, lived through a year of teaching via Zoom, right? So that really added a new layer to my perspective on this topic. And so for a little bit of history, just so you're like, what's going on? Oops, I think I stopped sharing. Let me fix my screen really quickly. Sorry, everyone. Okay, there we go. So a little bit of history, right, about myself. In academic year 1819, I served on a faculty learning community at Dominican where we focused on responsive and inclusive teaching, right? And so the year after that, we extended our work into learning about and participating in the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation process, the TRHT process. And then I've also served for more than 2 years on the university-wide core curriculum committee and the subcommittee that is completing an equity audit of our core. My institution has made a firm commitment to be an anti-racist institution, and it is within our faculty handbook under teaching and librarian effectiveness that we create inclusive classrooms. I also want to acknowledge my privilege, my position of privilege as a white woman who has had so many opportunities to learn and do this work. And with that knowledge, I come to you today as a librarian who strives to follow inclusive teaching pedagogy in all aspects of information literacy teaching. And a lot of the concepts in this presentation are not new, right? Sometimes we go to presentations and we're like, oh, I've heard this before. But I really fully believe that we need to be cognizant of inclusive teaching and continually consider how to be more inclusive when we meet with our students in various spaces. And then again, since I'm not an expert, I welcome any additional points or corrections that you have in the audience. And I hope that we'll leave the session with a better understanding of the components of inclusive teaching as it pertains to library instruction, and also hopefully gain some activities that you can integrate inclusive teaching into your practice. So before I advance to my next slide, I want to acknowledge that our challenge as librarian educators is that the information landscape is constantly changing, right? In so many ways, information literacy instruction is not and should not be just traditional bibliographic instruction. We are teaching extremely helpful meta skills that our students not just can be, good consumers of information while they're at college, but hopefully they can become critical of the information around them and understand their role in the information landscape beyond college. And again, I'll acknowledge that our biggest challenge is often we only have 30 or 50, maybe 75 minutes, right, with our students. So in my opinion, in order to be successful and gain traction with our students, in the time that we have, we need to be inclusive and create an environment that allows for students to move outside the confines of traditional seeking and evaluating information standards and start to think more critically about the information. We also need to address the fact that information literacy should also include aspects of media literacy, digital literacy, technology literacy, and the ways in which those conversations are shifting and growing, not just for our profession, but for our students. Okay, so I talked a little bit about who I am, right? Part of my training for the inclusive faculty community involved using tools like social and personal identity wheels. I'm just curious, I can't see all of you, but has anybody taken or used a social identity wheel or a personal identity wheel? It's all quiet. I have not. No. Okay, great. Sorry, I'm trying to keep all of my different screens here so I can see. Oh, never heard of it. I should have just had us start with that, I guess. So I think, Jason, I can share my slides with the audience later. I put some different wheels on here. Oh, yes, I see Elizabeth said through anti-bias training, right? That's how I got a hold of one of these as well. And these wheels are great because it helps you sort of think about the different aspects of your life and your position in the world, and also how you might present to others and ways in which you present to your students. And so it's something that I participate in a bunch of different groups. And I always find it really eye-opening for myself to think about who I am, how I present myself to my students, and who I am in reality. And it really helps me to consider and think about the way that my students may perceive me, or the assumptions they might make about me. And part of being inclusive, there is a bit of a possibility of vulnerability where I want my students to know me, but I also don't want to say, here's everything about me, right? Like I don't want to overwhelm them. But if there's something that I can share with them that makes them feel more comfortable with me, I definitely want to do that. And so I don't usually do this, but I'm being very vulnerable at the moment. If I think about who I am, I'm a white queer woman who has 2 master's degrees, but I come from a low income family. I'm a first generation college student. I have a hidden disability. You might not know that from sitting in this Zoom session with me, right? But I've had students, just by me sharing little things about my life, feeling really comfortable to talk to me about things bigger than just information literacy, and sort of build relationships that opens up myself and the library and our spaces to be more inclusive. So I know that most of my students are first generation. At Dominican, we're an HSI, and our students are mostly first generation. So I know that. They might not understand what the library resources are, what they could be useful for, or maybe they do. Maybe they're better equipped for research and critical thinking than I was ever at their age. I like to consider the ways in which I prefer to learn, and how it could affect the way I teach. I like active learning. I'm a visual learner. I don't like slides. I was just talking to Jason about the fact that I had slides and that our opening keynote didn't. But I know that talking to students, some of them do really appreciate the visual, the lecture style, so I try to mix it up a little bit and consider not just what I like to do, but what might be the best thing for the students. I will acknowledge that this past year really threw us through a loop, right? We were mostly a face-to-face program for instruction. And Dominican is known for its relationships. That's like a big thing that our students really enjoy, that they get to build these really great relationships with their faculty, with the staff, and with each other. And so we took that fully face-to-face to go totally Zoom for synchronous classes. And as the online learning and instructional services librarian, I can say that Zoom teaching has burned me out a little bit. It's harder for me to make those connections with our students. I work at a small school, and one of the things I really enjoy about Dominican is meeting the students in my classroom and then seeing them out in the world, seeing them out on campus, being able to be, hey, how's it going? How was your game? We have a lot of baseball players that end up in the classroom with me for some reason. And so I don't build those same connections. So it can be tricky. And then also, when I say, are you willing to do the work? Are you willing to sort of examine your own teaching practices and think the way in which students or your patrons will learn best? And are we doing the best that we can for them? So we're going to talk a little bit about inclusive teaching, which is deliberately cultivating a learning environment where all students are treated equitably, right? Having equal access and feel valued and supported. And we need to change the ways that systematic inequities shape the dynamics in teaching and learning spaces. And so it ideally stems from the instructor's awareness of the ways that bias and systematic inequities influence student access to learning experiences within specific disciplines and institutions. Putting this lens, this inclusive teaching lens on your teaching, either through a discipline or course or students or institution or interactions, it can pull from the principles of socially centered learning theories, such as critical pedagogy and feminist pedagogy, right? To embrace the role of social justice in education and seek to create greater agency for the learner, right? We want those learners to embrace their learning. We want them to be empowered by it and to start to see themselves growing and see themselves as part of the information landscape. So we've got critical pedagogy, right, where learners and educators participate in systems of oppression, but then they find ways to intervene. We have feminist pedagogy, where we're overcoming this estrangement and alienation of marginalized groups in education in order to reach a more enriching and equitable experience. And that word equity is going to come up again. And then we've got the inclusive pedagogy, right? Incorporating these to embrace all identities and cultures in a meaningful, contributing learning environment. So one way, right, that we can think about tying inclusive teaching to the framework, let's talk about ACRL framework for a minute, is to really think about, there was a session yesterday that I didn't get to attend, but I know the presenters and I read the synopsis, and I'm sure they did a fantastic job. A session about the authority is constructed and contextual. And this frame can be used in a way to be more inclusive in your teaching. You're teaching the students to disrupt systems of knowledge and ultimately power. You're helping your students seek ways to change systematic inequalities in the information that they acquire. They might be looking for those unlikely voices. They might be raising past history that was incorrect, right? So they're disrupting those systems, and they're really engaging in a way that is very meaningful. So we've got information social justice. So I have a Laura Saunders quote on this slide. I love this quote. I did not know she was the keynote speaker until I just paid more attention. And when I watched her speak yesterday, I was just like, yes, right on. So we've got information social justice, and social justice is the equal rights and equitable opportunity for all, right? But then we've also got information social justice, which means that information is created within existing power structures. Those power structures can impact the production and dissemination of information, as well as distort, suppress, misrepresent information, right? So to understand and use information most effectively, users must be able to examine and interrogate the power structures that impact that information and analyze the ways that information can be used to both inform and misinform. I think that's really important. So according again to Sanders, the adoption of information literacy as a social justice concept has not always been easy or comfortable. And I think this is really important for us to sort of sit with for a minute. Some librarians suggest that by intertwining information literacy and social justice, we are giving up our core values of neutrality and objectivity, while others have argued that we do not go far enough, and that for information social justice, it could be even more explicit part of conceptualizations of information literacy. Indeed, some libraries are not immune to struggle or to structural and systematic racism, misogyny, heteronormative assumptions and biases. If librarians do indeed want to embrace information social justice, they will need to engage in reflective practice to identify and challenge those inherent biases and oppressive practices. And there's a really great question in the chat. I will get to it, I promise. I'll be very transparent that I believe that it is imperative that librarians embrace the concept of information literacy as social justice. Okay, I'm glad you guys are still with me. I promise I'm gonna get to like some tangible activities we can do. So we're gonna talk a little more about some components of inclusive teaching and information social justice. So we probably all have a fairly good understanding of equality and equity, right? The definitions are up here, right? So equality is attempting to provide the same opportunities, right? Regardless of the needs of those in context. And then there is equity, right? So we're preparing a set of experiences with tailored to meet the particular needs of the students, right? So some students need extra supports, some may don't. And so you can see the difference in the language. That the example that I've heard in the past that I kind of like is equality is giving everyone a shoe. Equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. And I totally embrace the idea of equity, but I always kind of want to push a little further. So now we have this idea of liberation or justice, depending on the language. We just hired a Dominican, a new chief diversity officer, and she and I have had some really great conversations. And I just love this whole idea of liberation, right? So we've probably seen the equality versus equity one, right? The assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports versus equity, where everyone gets supports that they need, which produces equity. So justice or liberation is something that I've been very interested in the past year. So you can see that all of the people have supports or accommodations. They can see without a support or accommodation, right? Because the cause of the inequity has been addressed. The systematic barrier has been removed. And that's something that I've been really pondering and thinking about, like, why not tear down the fence, the metaphorical fence, and make education accessible to all and open up the conversation to people who are not included in the first place. So what new voices, new experiences, new everything can we experience or incorporate into our teaching if we are trying to deliberately include liberation into our teaching, right? There are systematic barriers within libraries and higher educations that we can break down. My heart goes out to one of my colleagues, Stephanie at Dominican, because we started working on a new push for OERs at Dominican, and it seems very obvious, right? But like promoting those sources, educating faculty and administrators, teaching students the value of resources and the potential harm of print textbooks can be liberating for our students and can be liberating for the services that we provide to our patrons. And I'd love to hear, when we get to the questions, other people's ideas of ways that we can break down inequities in libraries and higher ed. Okay. So we also need to think about cultural competence. With cultural competence, there's a set of behaviors, attitudes, policies that enable a person or a group to work effectively in cross-cultural situations, right? So it's a long definition. This definition is coming from the National Association of Social Workers, which is the definition that ALA uses if you look up ALA and cultural competencies. And so you can see from the graphic that there's many layers to being culturally competent. And you might ask yourself, like, why is it important to be culturally competent when using the lens of library instruction? So one, ALA has made cultural competencies one of its diversity standards. And there's 11 standards in which cultural competency plays a key role. And one of them is to promote program services and service delivery. So being culturally competent can help us create better connections with our community, lead better conversations around difficult topics. now we've got diversity consciousness. So we know diversity, right? Diversity is the representation of our varied identities and differences collectively and as individuals. And I think in libraries, as librarians, in whichever area of work you do, regardless of what you teach, or the fact that this is our code of ethics, and it's in our code of ethics to consider diversity, we should all try to understand diversity and become aware of it or lack thereof in our libraries and strive to acquire skills to understand diversity better. And often our patrons are not reflective of ourselves, right? There's a lot of systematic reasons that can happen. I'm gonna say something that maybe people don't always like, but we have a really expensive terminal degree, right? The master's degree in library science can be really expensive, and it can set up a barrier for populations because they don't see themselves in libraries or in a classroom. They don't, they can't muster spending that much money on a degree. And so entering into the profession, there's already barriers there that maybe doesn't help us diversify in ways that could be useful for our populations, right? So diversity consciousness is this awareness and understanding and skills that allow us to really think through and value human differences. And it requires the presence of diversity skills, diversity awareness, and a general understanding of diversity. I know my students are diverse. I know that they're diverse in many different ways. And I've had students recently surprise me with either their past experiences, their current experiences, but as it relates to their diversity and their experience as a college student. Almost there. So we've got critical information literacy theory, right? So it takes into consideration the social, political, economic, corporate systems of power and influence over information production, dissemination, consumption, right? And so as a theory and a practice, critical information literacy aims to understand how libraries participate in systems of oppression and find ways for librarians and students to act upon these systems. So critical information literacy applies critical theory, and most often the aim of critical pedagogy for libraries is to dare to imagine education as a site for generating social change. And so let's let that sink in for a minute, right? So it's not just limited to instruction. If we think about information literacy as a whole, as it's expressed across various sites, from libraries' educational efforts to the professional and societal forces that shape these activities, critical information literacy has so much to offer librarians seeking to rethink our approach to instruction, but also the goals and actions of libraries more generally. And this could come into your mission statement, it could come into your vision statement. It can manifest in many different ways. Okay. Oops, I skipped one. So next we've got UDL, right? And I'll just breeze through this one really quick. It's Universal Design for Learning. Universal design was created actually in architecture, where people were creating structures and noticing that if they put an elevator in, although it was supposed to serve one body, it ended up serving many people, right? For many different reasons. So now we break it out into education. And it's really to guide development of flexible learning environments, learning spaces that accommodate different learning, everyone's different individual learning differences, right? And what I've put in here for you all is there's actually 3 components to UDL. So there's multiple means of representation, multiple means of expression, multiple means of engagement. A lot of the success of UDL can come through formative feedback from students. And so these are just some ways in which I've integrated UDL into my classroom. The book creator is really cool. Digital ebooks, those are really fun. And I'm sure you all have done a lot of this already. Librarians like to be active, they like to be active teachers. So let's talk a little bit about inclusion in the classroom. So this first one is being more inclusive sometimes requires an ability to live with a little bit of awkwardness. This is something that stands out to me a lot. I don't like being awkward. I don't like being uncomfortable. I like feeling comfortable in the classroom. It is my place. Oh, I have 15 minutes. Thank you, Jason. And yeah, so you have to be a little bit awkward, right? So my classroom climate, one of the reasons it could be awkward, I guess I could step back, is you might run the risk of committing a microaggression. You might cross an unseen line. You need to be humble. You need to accept correction, even if it's in front of your students. And for example, a lot of the classes I work with deal with social justice issues. So one of my colleagues uses the Scene on Radio podcast. If you haven't listened to it, I would totally recommend it. It's amazing. But he uses that to examine the history of whiteness in the United States. He does not have any other readings. It is solely the podcast for a whole semester. And when I work with his class, he's already set the stage for students to understand that critical thinking is essential. And so I pick up on that and I make the connection between critical thinking, which is the analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment, and move it into information literacy. And I highlight that there may be different lenses that we need to take in order to evaluate and understand information from the podcast and the rest of the information landscape around this issue. And so the season that he uses really examines the history of whiteness in the United States over the last 300 plus years. It deals with issues of oppression, patriarchy, and how economics influence the history of racism and slavery in our country. It's really heavy, right? We take a historical lens. We talk about ways in which voices have and can be suppressed. I will put that in the chat for you in just a minute. It's called The Scene on Radio. Oh, thank you, Jason. Perfect. Jason, you should moderate all of my talks. So we look at library resources, but again, if we think about that frame, authority is constructed and contextual, we look everywhere. We don't just look at credo reference or like a history of slavery book. We try to look everywhere. We try to pull apart the information in the podcast to understand what's true, what's not true, and where are these unlikely now authoritative voices coming from? Why weren't they there? It can be a heavy conversation, right? I'm a white lady talking about the history of slavery in the United States, and I'm not teaching the content. We're just evaluating the information that comes with it. But I really enjoy working with that class and getting to have those conversations. So here's a big slide about inclusive practices, many ways you can be inclusive in the classroom, either face-to-face or virtual. And I'm curious, if you look over these, is there something that you've used that you feel like really has worked, or something that you haven't heard of before? And if you want to share that in the chat, that would be great. And so these are more situations of, OERs come up a lot, right? One that sticks out to me is being mindful of low ability cues, right? So we want to avoid that deficit model. And we all do it, right? I do it all the time. I think, oh, these students, they're coming from these certain high schools, these certain feeder schools. They probably didn't have a librarian. They probably didn't have experience at the library. They won't know what I'm talking about. I have to start from the beginning. But it's important to remember that our students are not coming to us as empty vessels. We're not using a banking model of education. We really want to think about, that they come with their own experiences, their own interests, their own fears, and understanding of the world. And I try really hard not to assume that our students don't already know something. They just might not have the same lingo as I do, right? Librarians have a lot of words that, like, what's a consortium? Or what do you mean database? Isn't Google a database, right? So I try to have in-depth conversations with the teaching faculty ahead of time about the culture of the class, whether anyone needs any accommodations or anything else besides this assignment, right? Because there's usually an assignment that helps the students feel just better in my classroom, honestly. So let's see, trying to be mindful of time. So ways to be inclusive, we could do all of these things, right? There's so many different options. One of the ones that I really like is life reports. So there's this idea that brains favor and retain lessons learned through concrete experiences with emotional, cogent and relevant stimuli, right? So they can make connections from their past experiences and make a meaningful connection to what we're going to do. So you might ask the students to think about past experiences in this life report, maybe do a quick minute paper. It doesn't need to be super personal. And I think that's something that we need to remember in our inclusion. We want our students to feel like they can share or not share as much as they want, right? But if they can think a little bit about their past experiences with information seeking and what that means to them, and then if someone's comfortable in class, which usually there's at least one, they'll share, and this can help build community for the students so that they feel like they're not alone. And they probably all have some fears or some experience that has been successful or not for them. And it's good for them to share that, right? So with the formative assessments, that's something that I try to do a lot. And we probably all do formative assessments, right? We probably do a survey at the end or a little quiz or something. I like to try to do more formative assessments towards the beginning of class. So I might ask them to just, how's it going? Where are we? Are we all together? Give me a thumbs up, something to sort of help me as I go be flexible in my teaching so that I make sure I'm reaching them where they need me to be. Again, that's that challenge that we have as librarians. We only get a little bit of time with them sometimes. Sometimes not. I have a few classes where I've gone in 2 or 3 or even 4 sessions over a semester. But making those connections can be tricky. So having those quick little formative assessments can be really great because that can help us adjust and grow what we're doing to meet the needs of our students. Not everybody's happy with sort of adjusting as they go, and I know that can be tricky, so I recognize that, but it can be really, really helpful for the students. So let me see what I got next for you all. So some of the things I like to do for OneShots, I like to maybe create an inclusive statement as part of my introduction. And, we'll say like, most of the inclusive teaching in higher ed is geared towards instructors who are teaching 4-credit classes, right? Like they get to spend a quarter or a semester with these students. And integrating into a one-shot, I will fully acknowledge is totally challenging at times, right? Like you have to have that flexibility. You want to create a situation where all the students can share. So having like a communication agreement, which I'll show you an example of, would be great. At the beginning of class, sometimes I might say something like, your experience in this session is valuable to me. We will be taking a critical lens when looking at the information you need for your assignment, and please feel free at any time to ask questions, check in. I will also ask questions, and I value your experiences and knowledge as it relates to the topics we're covering. It feels a little scripted, and it kind of is because I want to be intentional in what I'm saying. But I think it can be nice to let the students know, like, I'm here, you're here, I value you, I value your past experiences. Let's learn together, right? And also with Zoom, this has been a big question on my campus, and I think we could talk forever. And Jason, just let me know, I have 8 minutes. So I don't make people turn on their cameras with Zoom. I think it's very invasive. I don't like that it can give away too much personal information about students. I feel like it can make them feel extra vulnerable for some reason versus in the classroom. And especially those kids that like to sit at the back of the room, like they already like to sit at the back of the room. And now we're asking them to be on camera with our face right in front of us, right? I want them to feel open and welcome, right? And feel safe enough to speak or participate. So here's my conversation agreement. I'll go real quick with that. I don't know if you all have used conversation agreements before, but especially when we're talking about certain topics like the history of slavery, sometimes I might say, we're going to have some conversations about the information landscape around this topic. And we're trying to take a historical lens, but let's make sure that we're not critiquing people, speak from your own experience, etc. The move up and move back is my favorite. That's from my friend Jane. She uses it in her English class. It just means that if you're someone who talks a lot, take a step back. Let others who maybe don't speak as much take a chance to answer the question. And same, if you're not someone who speaks a lot, challenge yourself to speak more. So here's a bunch of some inclusive activities that we can do. My favorite one, and I cannot remember the name of the person who did this, but it was through a Carly Instruction webinar, I think, talked about drawing the research process, what it looks like to them, right? So what does it feel like? What is that process like for them? And then can they share that, right? Can they share that with each other, build that community of this is my experience, this is what worked for me, what didn't work for me. But it allows a little bit of creativity and reflection. I like to do it at the beginning of class. And then maybe at the end, they can do another drawing if they're comfortable. So those are some of the ways in which I do this. Also, something that I think about a lot is that my students a lot of the times are not always researching stuff that would be in like traditional library resources, right? So often it's popular and it's very recent. So sometimes I talk to students about like that inevitable challenge they might come across when they're just searching library resources. I have the same conversation with faculty too. And I'm not afraid to talk to faculty and say, do they have to use a book? Why do they have to use a book? And when I remove that, then sometimes I feel like people are like, oh, well, then why would I come to the library? Well, you come to the library to have a librarian do some information literacy instruction with you, because I am the expert on all of these topics, right? In information literacy, and I can teach them good skills without having to use a library database. And one of the topics that I use a lot, although I feel like it's getting old, I feel bad even saying that, is the Egypt uprising of 2011 and the Twitter revolution. And we talk a little bit about that, and the unlikely voices that came out of that, the ways in which social media is being used to coordinate efforts to, upend non-democratic regimes. And we talk about other sort of unlikely sources for information on those types of topics. So we're not going to watch my video. I love this video if you've never watched it before. So seek out student perspectives. If you have a chance, talk to your students. What works, what doesn't work in the class? Did you like that I did this? Did you feel vulnerable when I did this? Was this just a flop and horrible? Get the idea of what the students need. It's as valuable, I think, as talking to the teaching faculty personally. And then another one that I love is get someone to observe you in your teaching. I think observation is so critical. And I have a link to an inclusive instruction observation checklist. One of the best advice that I received from one of my colleagues at Dominican, who I just adore, was to, provide your observer with guidelines, talk to them first, have them come and observe, and then debrief after, right? So you need to put it in your court, right? Like what works, what didn't work, but you want it to be on a certain lens. So don't be afraid to sort of say, I want to observe, but this is what I want you to look at. So with that, I saw 3 minutes. Okay. Barriers and questions. So with the little time we have left, what are some additional barriers you might face at your institution when we're thinking about inclusive teaching? And what additional questions do you have for me? So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all of your faces. And I am going to drop the link for Sarah, asked for a link for the, I'm going to make sure everything's available. I'll figure that out for you guys. Jason, will they be able to see my slides, or should I put them in the chat?
We are going to be collecting slides and putting the videos and slides onto the website in the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
However fast we can get things up there, we'll be putting this talk today on.
Okay. And I do have a list of references at the end as well. So those I'll just pop in there right now for you guys. But is there any questions? I'm sorry, I feel like I talked way too fast.
That was great, Raleigh.
Or any perceived barriers you face at your institution. I mean, I totally transparent. Like, I don't want to do bibliographic instruction. I want to be super, super inclusive. But if I only have 20 minutes with the students and they need to at least know where the library website is, that's what I got to do. So I can't always be inclusive.
So are there any questions for Molly? Go ahead. You can speak them, or you can pop them in the chat box. I guess I guess we can go over a couple of minutes.
Hi, Molly. This is Nancy.
Hi.
Hey. This is great, by the way. It's amazing. What kind of feedback did you get from your students?
About the classes, like about being inclusive in class?
Yes.
So it's hard. I feel like my students this year have just thrown me through a loop. Like I literally met with a class where every single box was black with just their name. And I would talk and I'd say, hey guys, and I do like all my stuff that I try to do on Zoom to make me seem cool to a bunch of undergrads. And like they literally didn't even respond to me. I had some that just did not even give me like a thumbs up.
Mm.
And that just hurt my heart. But also I understand it's hard. So
What about pre-pandemic? I mean, pre-Zoom. Let's talk about better times.
yeah, pre-Zoom. So my students really like the research process. They really like the tangible work that they can do where maybe we will draw a mind map and then they'll give each other critiques. I love it when students do peer-to-peer critiques and that sort of thing. I mean, generally they're fairly happy with having a classroom environment where they can share their experiences if they want and make connections with their research. I think I want more more student feedback, because sometimes when I ask them, I'll do like a little minute paper or something and they'll be like, oh, this was great. I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't tell me anything. So if I can kind of tease it out a little bit more from them, I find things like the more quick formative assessments can give me better feedback, or the like the drawing type stuff can give me better feedback as well. But I mean, Nancy, that's a challenge, right? Like the students are going to just look at you and be like, oh, that was good, thanks.
All the time. Yeah, I don't even know whether to do the 1 minute paper anymore because I just get very few comments. Although I get more comments on the Padlets in the Zoom sessions than I did in face-to-face for some reason.
Well, and I still did Padlet in classroom. I still did Kahoots and everything else. And I think you're right, Nancy, because there's a level of being anonymous. I can't say that word. That can help them feel more comfortable to share.
Molly, I think we have one question here. How do you teach something very practical, like how and why of citations through this lens?
Oh, yeah. I mean, why do we cite? Why do we cite? We cite because we want, the students are going to say we cite because they don't want to get caught plagiarizing, right? But there's so much bigger issue, right? We're giving a voice to the source, right? We are acknowledging it, putting it into the scholarly landscape, right? Oh, I like that idea, using only initials and try to eliminate gender and racial bias. I think that's great. And that's another thing, Becky, let's just talk about this for the next few hours. Like, the landscape of information, who has the privilege to be published, who has the ability to get their information out there. So we can talk too about like if we're citing a website, are we and building our credibility is true too. But if we're citing a website, are we giving a voice to that source? Are we making it authoritative? We're entering it into a so-called canon. So I think there's a lot of ways that we could really take this lens with them in a lot of different, yes, helping other people locate information is very important. We are librarians after all.
This is great. So thank you everybody for coming, and let's give a round of applause for Molly Mansfield. That was a great talk on inclusive education and information literacy. I'm gonna have to watch this one again.
I did kind of, so I do teach graduate students. I did kind of feel like I was teaching my class at one point, so I'm sorry if I over lectured you all.
No, it was great. I think it was great. I think that's what everybody needed for the last breakout session. Really something to think about and really ponder and try to practice. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Molly, for a wonderful presentation. Again, remember at, I don't even know what time now. In 10 minutes, 1:25, our closing keynote will be happening in the links that you guys have at the website. So hopefully we'll see you all at the closing keynote with Lisa Hincliffe from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Have a great closing keynote and have a great weekend. Thanks again, Molly.
Yeah, thanks everybody for taking the time. I really appreciate it.